Ahoy, adventurers! Joe Buddy Hambone here with another coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is ROLLDICE, and it is good through September 7th for $6 off orders of $25 or more, either online or in person. Now, you heard me right. It is $6 off orders of $25 or more, either online or in person, using the code ROLLDICE. And hey, it's back to school season, so if you're already out there picking up some pencils and papers, why not get yourself a new set of dice or maybe a brand new RPG to kick the fall season off right? Use the code ROLLDICE. And if you're shopping at Noble Knight Games already, on August the 10th, which is the day this episode airs, Noble Knight Games is doing their free RPG Day online event. They're kicking it off with a special deal that for every $15 you spend, you can obtain any of the RPG Day promo items for only a penny. Be sure to check out their website for more details on that. And don't forget to use the code ROLLDICE to get $6 off an order of $25 or more, either online or in person, now through September 7th, from your friends and mine, Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. He's the only man I know who owns multiple grimoires, Stu Horvath.
Is that true? Really?
I don't know many man who owns more than one.
Well, there you go. There's 3 right on my shelf, right above my head.
Well, there you go. Stu, how you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm kind of fantastic, man. Just trying to have a summer like everybody else.
Yeah.
So what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about Arduin, and specifically the Arduin Grimoires, which is a series of 8 books written by David Hargrave beginning in 1977.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. So the True Detective show, it was the line from that, time is a flat circle.
Yes, indeed. The way it feels in the year of our Lord, or Dark Lord, 2020.
I've been looking to get the Arduin Grimoire for a long time. He self-published them back in 77. They look and feel basically the same as the original white box D&D books, like that sort of digest-sized chapbook, stapled, folded pages kind of vibe.
Yeah, almost fanzine-like.
Yeah, exactly. Very fanzine-like. And the first 3 are typewritten, and the typewriter pages were shrunk down on a photocopier, so like the type is really small and very hard to read. It's like you get eye strain.
It's both very cool and infuriating at the same time.
Kinda, yeah. So I was trying to get them for so long because like they just seemed cool. It was just like a 77. Like that's really early. And this guy was cranking out his own campaign world and like just putting it out there in zines in the Bay Area. And I thought that was cool. He had some intersections with Greg Stafford. Chaosium almost put it out, but they thought it was too derivative of Dungeons and Dragons at the time. And then there's like this funny little rivalry between the two. Hargrave writes a spell that sort of like throws Stafford under the bus. But my larger point is that there's this dude and he's making a hacked D&D game in 77. It's all his homebrew rules. Crazy rules. Like people swear that he was one of the best game masters who ever lived, or at least of the period. I don't believe that because they're just way complicated for my personal tastes, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, on a previous episode, we were talking about Tunnels and Trolls and how that was a super light hack of Dungeons and Dragons happening around the same time, right?
Even earlier, 75 is when Tunnels and Trolls came out. Think of Arduin as the exact opposite, like lower production quality and more complicated.
That sounds like a nightmare.
But it's cool. But time is a flat circle because I feel like it's easy to forget that A, Tunnels and Trolls did their thing with their rules light version. B, Arduin was there in 77 doing like OSR stuff in 77. Like, you know, and you had Bunnies and Burrows around 77 too, coming out with like the weird, slightly outside the norm of fantasy. Slightly, it's about bunnies.
I was gonna say
Outside the norm of, you're right, of fantasy role playing, and like all these 3 things, they all are like the old school 70s versions of all the cool movements that are going on today. And like, I don't think that they're all that different, really. Like,
They all seem like two sides of the same coin, but different coins.
I like that. Yeah, and I mean, of course, there's 40 years of like evolution and polish and best practices and stuff, but I feel like all of the stuff that we're still doing today and we're still reading and we're still playing and we're still experimenting with, all of that stuff is spinning out of stuff that happened almost immediately after Dungeons and Dragons started. And it still doesn't get nearly enough credit. D&D still overshadows everything, right?
Well, listen, he who has all the money and the good printing presses are going to get all the glory.
That sweet Random House distribution.
I mean, it's been said that whoever writes the history books writes the history.
That's true.
And so we are in a place where, I mean, to be honest, when I started this episode, I thought there was only one grimoire for Arduin. Like, I didn't know it was a volume of 8. And that says a lot about games living in the shadow of D&D, even from back then. You know, when you pick up Steam like Dungeons and Dragons did with TSR and the Random House distribution, of course it's going to overshadow everybody. Because when you go into that Walden Books, what are you actually going to see on the shelf?
You're not seeing Arduin, that's for sure. I mean, like, the first 3 volumes were all self-published. Volumes 4 through 8, they're all done through a place called Dragon Tree Press, which is sort of still around. Big question mark, though. It's got a website, but they're rebuilding it.
You might be rebuilding it for years. You never know.
Yeah, honestly, that rebuilding site could be from, like, 2010. I don't know.
They're still switching it over from a GeoCities.
Yeah, right? Angel Fire.
Ooh.
So when Dragon Tree Press starts doing it, they're perfect bound. They have actual typesetting. It's not photocopied anymore, and the production quality goes up. But still, you pick them up and you know that these were never in bookstores. If they were in bookstores, they were in like, you know, little mom and pop shops and hobby shops that were in the local area. That's where you would find Arduin. And like, I've never seen one in the wild here. I've never seen one in the wild, or I would have bought it.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, figuring that they were essentially fanzines to a degree being printed with 70s material, I can't imagine many of them have stood the test of time. And if they are, they have to be in someone's collection like under lock and key.
Yeah, no, these are solid books, man. They are like the finest, toughest zines that I have ever seen. You know how like Dragon Magazine, like you look at it funny and the cover falls off?
Yeah.
Like these staples are fused with the paper. In putting together my set of 8, I've bought several of the first 3 until I got all 8 all at once. So like I had a couple copies of stuff, and every single one of them is perfect in terms of just like its structural integrity. Like they're worn, they're used, they've obviously been read. The older ones, they're all sort of printed on parchment style paper, so they naturally have a yellow look.
Oh, that's cool.
As the acid in the paper kind of runs crazy, they get this really nice chestnut brown color.
There's something really like magical about that.
Yeah. They're super sturdy. They're super high quality. These aren't like 90s zines, like where, you know, it's just like 3 sheets of paper stapled together is what I'm trying to say. There's a level of quality to it. And it's so crazy. Like the first volume, you picked this up, and I mentioned earlier that I thought these were books about a campaign setting because his world was Arduin, and he calls this the Arduin Grimoire. So I was thinking, oh, these are like early source books. Nope. Almost zero source material about a world.
Really?
Yeah, it's all just rules and tables, like random tables for crazy stuff. He had like special abilities that you would be able to bolt onto your character. He had rogue magic that only rogues could use.
Wow.
He had a million different like character classes. He's just like, hey, these are rules for a role-playing game. And he never really defines that. He doesn't say, these are my house rules for my Dungeons and Dragons game. He never says that, which sort of presages the idea of everybody who's just like compatible with the world's most famous role-playing game. Like how everybody like hedges that so that they don't have to get sued. Like
Yeah.
he was doing that already, but like from a place of naivete where he was just like, I'm just going to put all these rules and people are going to know because I'm probably going to be selling it to them in person.
Yeah, that feels right. You got to love the old wink, wink, nudge, nudge to avoid litigation.
Yeah. And he got in trouble too because he printed them and designed them to look like D&D books. Like you put the first 3 next to the OD&D box books, like they're the same size and the same aesthetic. So TSR did come after him, but they didn't sue him too bad. I guess he changed some stuff. I think there's copies that have whiteout over the stuff that they took issue with.
Well, yeah, he's not going to pay to reprint that stuff. Printing stuff is expensive.
Yeah.
And it's always been expensive. So you're telling me that these books fit like perfectly in the box? I mean, that's a good racket, man. That's a good trick.
They do fit perfectly in the box if you're so inclined.
Oh, that's a beautiful read between the lines kind of sales pitch.
Yeah, and he got so much weird stuff crammed in here and no kind of system to it. It's all just shoved in. So like the first book, like he mentions this class that's called Techno, which I'm like, well, that's interesting. What could that possibly be? They're guys who have laser guns, but you don't get the actual table of the laser guns and what they cost, what kind of damage they do, their range, any of that stuff. You don't get that until the third grimoire.
So he's giving you like a teaser for like later books? Or he just was like, I don't have it yet, but I'll just put it here. Page count.
I honestly think that he was just putting anything in. Like, I think that one day he was just like, I'm going to put all the classes in. And like, he just sort of forgot for 2 issues to put the thing that you need to play the character, you know? It's crazy.
Like, I know there's that saying that is done is better than perfect, but done seem done.
That is exactly the best way to describe Arduin is done is better than perfect, because he's constantly also saying that like this is the last one and there's another one that comes out. It's wild, and that wildness is reflected in the text because there's everything and anything in there. And of course, because it's the 70s, there's some gross sexist stuff in there. I'm not going to dwell on it because you could easily just skip over it. I actually totally missed it in the first couple times I read it. And then I was just like, wait, no. He actually has a whole table of charisma bonuses and penalties based on a woman's measurements.
Oh, my.
And it's like the 3rd page of the 2nd volume. And it's easy to miss because the text is so like...
Wow.
Painful on the eyes. Like I see a chart and I'm just like, well, that doesn't look particularly interesting. Move along. But I caught it. I was just like, oh man, that is just gross. Like there's just no getting around that. That's gross. It's just a bummer when you see something that's cool and wild and like you want to love it unconditionally. And then there's something like stupid like that. You're just like, God damn it. Like you were so close, man.
You can't unsee that.
Yeah.
And also at the same time, you look at it as the constant argument of, well, it's a product of its time, but it was never really acceptable in any time. So it's kind of is what it is, and probably why it didn't have the mass appeal, because I can't imagine a lot of people opening that up, seeing that and going, yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to do that.
Lawrence Schick says that in Heroic Worlds of Arduin that it's unencumbered by good taste. And that is true. There's gradients to it, right? You want to have like big booby warrior ladies, like fine, whatever. It's not my thing, but I get it. There's like that campiness. It's fine. But
well, in the 70s, you had like Grindhouse. You had like B movies. I mean, this is the world as it is back then.
Schlock and sleaze and like that stuff is an aesthetic, whether you like it or not. But then you cross that line with something like that chart because it just makes folks uncomfortable. No woman is going to see that and be like, I want to play your game.
Yeah.
That said, there's still fantastic books to check out and get the temperature of the time. I feel like when you read them and look through them, you get a window into the world of role-playing games in the 70s, but like unburdened by all of the nostalgia that we all have from the massive monolith that D&D is. It's a rawer and stranger world in there, man. Like I said, the techno class that has like laser guns and stuff, that fusion of science fiction and fantasy, he's doing that years before Barrier Peaks. Like a lot of this stuff is ahead of its time. And it's funny how long it takes for D&D to kind of catch up. And when it does catch up, how watered down it is. But at the same time, how obtuse so many of his rules are in terms of complexity and just like difficult to master. And like he really embraces that antagonistic relationship between the player and the GM. He claims in one of the books that in 4 years of running his Arduin campaign, he's killed 480 player characters.
And none of them were women.
Probably not. It's like 120 people a year. That's one every 3 days. And I was like, that's crazy. Can you imagine playing once every 3 days? I can.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I know about the OSR movement is that it's always been kind of the Wild West and unencumbered by, you know, corporate politics and policies. So it makes sense that something like an Arduin hacking it, even back then, would not have to worry about ever getting watered down because these are the ideas and I would say their purest form, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when Dungeons & Dragons is coming out now, even though it hit a point where it was coming out hot and heavy, there is still a certain, like, we are a company. and people are here that we have to answer to. So there's always going to be that line.
Even beyond that line, there's just simple editing and like organizational skills that just aren't apparent in Arduin. Even once he gets to Dragon Tree and the stuff does sort of have like a little bit more orderly, it's still all over the place. And unfortunately, that idea of sort of like the crass GM, you know, that guy, I'm not talking about anybody specific. I'm just talking about your generic gaming shop. And you go in and you just want to play a game, and there's that guy who just sours you on the place because he's like a little bit of a know-it-all. He's like really abrasive. And every time you go in, he's there and he's cracking some joke, and you just don't want to be around that guy.
Yeah, the living embodiment of, well, actually.
Kind of. I have no idea what Hargrave was really like, but there's a certain amount of that sort of archetype baked in that comes through in Arduin. And because Arduin feels to be like the foundation of the OSR impulse and aesthetic to a degree, I feel like that archetype carries forward, and you can sort of trace like, oh, there's this jerk in the OSR scene. He says a lot of the same jerky things that Hargrave says in Arduin. Like I said, time is a flat circle. We're all fighting the same battles and playing the same games and thinking the same things that people were thinking 40 years ago. And 40 years from now, our children and their children's children will be doing the same thing.
And all still hopefully rolling polyhedral dice. So, Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the Arduin Grimoire?
Yeah, my final thought is that even as much of an abrasive thing Arduin kind of is, it's definitely raw and it's unfiltered, for better and for worse simultaneously, right? I like this thing and I'm also critical of it. But every once in a while, you kind of think you made up your mind about something and it throws you a curveball. And Arduin did that in the fourth book, Lost Grimoire, which came out in 1984. It was the first one that came out under Dragon Tree Press. It's a pretty crap Arduin book. Everything before it and after it is better. But in the midst of this book that's sort of mediocre, he always has new monsters, always. And he had the Fraint, which are like these insect men that are like everybody's favorite thing about Arduin, and might have possibly inspired D&D's Thrycreen. So always a big section on monsters. In this one, he has a Falconor.
Say what now?
A Falconor, which is, if you just take the Y and the N out of it, it's Falcor.
Wow.
It's also known as a luck dragon. It's a direct ripoff of Neverending Story. Neverending Story is a movie that I'm fond of my memories of, but every time I see it, I'm horrified by how terrible a movie it is. And I just love the idea of big bad DM David Hargrave going to the theaters to see Neverending Story, period. Like, I just love that image. And then I love the fact that he, I guess, was so enamored of it or so offended by it or something. He has a really wacky sense of humor that carries through. And the fact that he put Falcor in Arduin, like, I don't know if it makes up for the female attributes chart, but it does something. It makes me laugh is what it makes me do.
My God. So this is another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posting things like Arduin every day.
Very cool. You could find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about board games. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. You could also follow my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you love the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. And if you like the show, kind of want to take it to the school dance, think about going over to our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got a ton of bonus content on there, including early release episodes, including some real cool things that are happening behind the scenes that we're sharing with our patrons. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.